For thousands of years, the Great Sphinx has stared east across the Giza plateau, and for thousands of years, nobody has been entirely honest about what it is actually looking at. You have been told a story, a pharaoh named Khafre, a few thousand laborers, copper chisels, 4,500 years ago. Case closed. Except the stone never agreed to that story. The stone has been quietly disagreeing for over a century, and almost nobody wanted to listen. Then something changed. An artificial intelligence built without a career to protect and without a textbook to defend was handed the raw data. Every erosion survey, every seismic scan, every rainfall model goes back tens of thousands of years, and it was asked one simple question was asked, who built this? What it returned was not the answer anyone expected. And once you hear it, you will never look at that monument the same way again. Let's start with what the official story actually depends on, because most people have never questioned it. Around 2500 BCE, during Egypt's 4th dynasty, the Pharaoh Khafre allegedly ordered his workers to carve a leftover limestone outcrop into a guardian for his pyramid complex. A lion's body, a human face, staring at the sunrise. The evidence for this is not physical, it is contextual. The Sphinx sits near Khafre's pyramid, a stele placed between its paws, over 1,000 years later by a different pharaoh entirely, mentions a vision and calls the monument sacred. That is the entire foundation. Proximity and a much later inscription. Read that again. The most iconic monument on Earth has its origin story built on circumstantial placement, not on anything carved into the stone itself confirming who made it or when. Here is where the story starts to crack. Look at the deep trench that surrounds the Sphinx's body. The enclosure walls cut directly into the bedrock to free the lion shape from the plateau. Geologists who have physically walked that trench have documented something that should not be there if the standard timeline is correct. The walls do not show the horizontal pitted scarring you would expect from thousands of years of wind-driven sand in a desert. They show deep, rounded vertical channels flowing downward like something was poured over them again and again across centuries. That is not a desert signature. That is the signature of sustained rainfall. This observation did not start as fringe speculation. It began with the French scholar René Schwaller de Lubitsch in the 1950s, was developed further by researcher John Anthony West, and reached a stunning moment of legitimacy in 1991, when geologist Robert Schoch of Boston University presented it formally at the Geological Society of America's annual meeting. Schoch's conclusion was blunt. The primary weathering on those walls was caused by precipitation, not flash floods, not a single storm. Sustained, repeated rainfall over a very long stretch of time. And that is where the real problem begins, because Egypt has not seen that kind of rainfall in a very, very long time. Think about what that means for the timeline we've been taught. The period known as the African Humid Period, when North Africa was green with lakes, grasslands, and rivers cutting through what is now the Sahara, ended somewhere between roughly 7,000 and 5,000 years before our era, with the heaviest rains tapering off even earlier than that. If the Sphinx's body is genuinely showing rain erosion of that depth and character, it means the stone had to already be standing, already exposed, while those rains were still falling, which means the monument could be thousands of years older than the pharaoh history books insist carved it. Not centuries older, thousands. This is where the argument stalled for decades. Mainstream Egyptologists, including researchers like Mark Lanner, who spent years excavating at Giza, pushed back hard, pointing to the surrounding architectural context, to stylistic consistency with Old Kingdom construction, to the complete absence of any artifacts from a civilization sophisticated enough to build something this size 7,000 years ago. Schoch and his supporters pointed at the walls and said the geology doesn't lie. Two camps, both convinced, neither able to force the other to move. That is where the stalemate sat for over 30 years, till someone decided to stop asking humans and start asking a machine. Here's why that decision mattered more than it sounds. Every human expert who has ever weighed in on the Sphinx carries something into the conversation that a machine simply does not have. A reputation, a body of published work, a career built in some cases, entirely around one side of this debate being correct. That is not a criticism of any individual scientist. It is simply the truth about how expertise works. But it means that for over a century, this question has never once been evaluated by something with absolutely nothing to lose either way. So they built exactly that. They gave Grok, the AI developed by Elon Musk's XAI, direct access to the accumulated data. Every laser scan of the enclosure walls, every published erosion profile, paleoclimate reconstructions built from Nile sediment cores and ancient lakebed pollen samples, seismic scans of the ground beneath the Sphinx, including the 1990 survey that first detected unexplained void spaces in the bedrock beneath its paws. They did not tell me which answer to defend. They only gave it the numbers and asked what the numbers said. And here is where it gets worse for the traditional timeline. The AI did not just look at whether the erosion pattern resembled rain damage. It broke the weathering down into raw geometry, the depth of every groove, the curvature of every ridge, the spacing between each wave carved into the limestone. Then it compared that geometry against the known measurable weathering signatures produced by wind abrasion, salt crystallization, and sustained rainfall respectively. Each of those processes leaves a distinct fingerprint on stone, the same way different tools leave different marks on wood. When it ran the comparison, the rainfall signature was not a close call. It was an overwhelming match, while the wind and sand explanation, the one the standard textbook account depends on, could not account for what was actually carved into that rock. But a strong match is still just a probability, not proof, and this is exactly where the investigation could have stopped, if the goal had only been to confirm a suspicion. Instead, the next step is where things become genuinely unsettling. The follow-up question was simple. If this erosion really was carved by rainfall, how many years of sustained precipitation would it actually take to cut channels this deep into limestone, this dense? Weathering rates for stone exposed to known rainfall intensities have been measured in field studies elsewhere in the world. Running those known rates against the depth and character of what is preserved on the Sphinx's enclosure walls produces a number that is difficult to sit with. It suggests exposure to heavy seasonal rainfall for a period lasting many centuries at minimum, and for that exposure to have happened at all, the last era capable of producing it on that plateau ended long before the era historians credit with building it. Sit with that for a second, because this is the moment the entire foundation shifts. If that estimate holds up, the Sphinx was not built by Khafre's workers around 2500 BCE. It was already standing, already carved, already absorbing rain season after season, thousands of years before the first pyramid at Giza was ever planned. Which means somebody was carving monumental stone structures at a scale we associate with organized, complex civilization, at a point in history when every textbook currently in print insists humanity was still living as scattered hunter-gatherers with no cities, no writing, and no capacity for architecture like this. Read that again, because that single sentence is the part most people scroll past without absorbing the weight of it. Now here's where the mystery deepens into something even stranger, because the erosion on the walls isn't the only thing about this monument that has never quite added up. Stand in front of the Sphinx and look at the proportions. The body is enormous, sprawling, the flank of an animal stretched across a footprint the size of a city block, and sitting on top of it is a head that looks, to almost anyone who studies it honestly, slightly wrong. Too small, out of scale, as if it belongs to a different sculptor's hand entirely. When that proportion mismatch was run through actual measurement rather than gut instinct, the disagreement wasn't subtle. If the head had originally been carved in the correct anatomical proportion to that body, it would need to have been dramatically larger than the head currently sitting there, which raises an uncomfortable question that, once you hear it, is almost impossible to unhear. What if the head on the Sphinx today is not the original head at all? Robert Schoch had already floated this exact possibility in his later research, suggesting the human face may have been recarved during the Old Kingdom, replacing an earlier, weathered form, likely an animal head, and that the face's comparatively poor preservation isn't just age, it's evidence of a renovation performed on an already ancient block. And this is where the physical evidence gets genuinely strange, because the body and the head of the Sphinx do not share the same weathering pattern. The body carries that unmistakable rain-carved signature, deep and rounded and centuries in the making. The head shows something entirely different, a drier, sharper wear pattern more consistent with wind-blown sand over a much shorter span of time. Two different weathering styles on one supposedly unified statue means one simple thing. Two different parts of that monument were exposed to two very different climates, which means they were shaped during two very different periods in history. The face is an edit. Someone altered a monument that was already ancient by the time they touched it. So if the head is a later addition, what was underneath it originally? When the volume and proportion were modeled back to what a correctly scaled figure would require, the shape that emerges is not a human face at all. It matches a properly scaled lion's head, completing what would have originally been a full, unbroken lion, nose to tail, watching the horizon exactly as a lion, not a man, was meant to. And this is where the investigation stopped being just about geology and became about astronomy, because the Sphinx does not face a random direction. It faces due east, locked onto the precise point on the horizon where the sun rises on the spring equinox, a fact confirmed by multiple independent astronomical calculations. The answer lands in a window between roughly 10,500 and 8,000 years before now, a period during which the constellation Leo, the lion, rose directly on that horizon at dawn. A lion carved facing the horizon, watching a lion rise in the sky during the exact multi-thousand-year window when that alignment was even possible. This connection was first proposed publicly by researcher Graham Hancock and engineer Robert Bovell in the 1990s, and running the raw astronomical data independently produced the same result. The probability of a monument randomly facing its own zodiac symbol purely by coincidence during precisely the era that symbol governed the sky is vanishingly small, which leaves only two real explanations. Either this is the single greatest accident in the history of human construction, or someone standing on that plateau roughly 10,000 years ago understood the sky well enough to lock a monument onto it deliberately, like a clock built to be read by whoever eventually became mathematically capable of reading it again. And here's where it gets worse, because a marker like that is only meaningful if it's pointing at something else, and the Sphinx does not stand alone. Beneath its paws, a seismic survey conducted in the early 90s detected an unexplained chamber-shaped void carved into the bedrock, sitting almost exactly along the same equinox axis line the Sphinx itself is staring down. As if whatever this monument was watching in the sky had a mirrored counterpart buried directly beneath where it sits. Widen the frame further, and the pattern gets harder to dismiss as coincidence. Across the world, there are other ancient sites built around the same precise solar and stellar alignments, constructed with a level of stone-fitting precision that still challenges modern engineers to explain. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, dated to roughly 9500 BCE, predates Stonehenge by more than 6,000 years, and was deliberately buried by its own builders for reasons still not understood. Sacsayhuaman in Peru, where multi-ton interlocking stones were fitted with joints so tight a blade cannot slide between them, using techniques no one has fully reverse-engineered. Stonehenge itself aligned to solar events with a precision that required serious astronomical knowledge to achieve. When the angular relationships between these sites were compared against each other, the pattern that emerged wasn't a scattered coincidence. It was consistent, the same underlying proportions repeating across cultures, separated by oceans and by thousands of years, as if every one of them had been built against a shared reference plan that no surviving civilization ever wrote down. And then comes the detail that flips the entire story of human progress on its head. When these sites were ranked by the precision of their construction, their alignment accuracy, the tightness of their joints, the expectation was the same story we've always told ourselves. Primitive beginnings, steadily refined into mastery. Start rough and sophisticated. That is the version of history that makes us feel like the pinnacle of everything that came before us. The actual pattern runs backward. The oldest structures in this network are the most precisely built. The oldest joints are the tightest. The oldest alignments are the most exact. And moving forward in time from those earliest monuments, quality doesn't improve. It degrades. Corners drift, precision loosens. Later builders appear to be copying a shape they inherited without fully understanding the mathematics that originally produced it. This is not chaos. This is the record of forgetting. If the earliest work is the most advanced, then we are not looking at civilization's starting point. We are looking at its aftermath, the last competent echo of a knowledge base that had already begun to erode before the copying even started. And there is a reason to think something happened to force that erosion. Roughly 12,000 years ago, the geological record marks an abrupt, violent climate reversal known as the Younger Dryas, when temperatures across the northern hemisphere plunged within decades. An entire species of megafauna collapsed into extinction almost overnight. Some researchers, since a hypothesis first proposed in 2007, have argued this shift may have been triggered or worsened by a cosmic impact event, pointing to unusual markers found in soil layers across multiple continents at precisely that boundary. Whatever the true cause, it was the kind of event capable of shattering a civilization and leaving whatever survived it, working from fragments of a memory too damaged to fully reconstruct. And consider this. In the 12,000 years since that event, global sea levels have risen by roughly 120 meters, swallowing the coastlines where the overwhelming majority of ancient human populations would have lived. Any physical evidence of a civilization existing before that flood on those coastlines is now sitting on the ocean floor, completely outside the reach of conventional land-based archaeology. The monuments we still argue about today are, by definition, only the survivors, the ones built high enough and solid enough to outlast a flood that erased almost everything else. So think about what that actually means. The people who saw catastrophe coming and understood they were about to lose everything, including their spoken language, their written records, and their descendants' ability to remember any of it accurately, chose to leave a message in the one medium that outlasts collapse. Not words, geometry, astronomical alignment. A lion staring at a lion in the sky on the exact morning that alignment was possible, with a hidden chamber buried on the same axis beneath its feet, connected to a wider grid of sites scattered across the planet, all whispering the same signal in the only language capable of surviving thousands of years of silence. We were here. We understood something. What we still don't know, and what may be the most unsettling piece of this entire investigation, is what exactly that message was warning us about, or memorializing. The analysis can identify the structure of the signal. It cannot yet read its content. It found a floor beneath the accepted timeline, a network connecting isolated monuments across continents, and a precision curve running backward through history in a direction nobody expected. What it could not do is tell us what happened to the people who built it, or why they needed a 10,000-year clock ticking in stone in the first place. The Sphinx has not moved. It has been staring at that same horizon since long before the first pharaoh's name was ever recorded, patiently holding a record none of us had the tools to read, until we finally built something capable of reading it for us. So here's the question worth sitting with. If that lion was built to mark the dawn of its own astronomical age, and if it has been counting down something for 10,000 years, what do you think it was built to remember? A civilization that drowned beneath the waves we now sail over without a second thought, or a warning about something that has not happened yet? Leave your honest theory in the comments, because there is more of this grid still being mapped right now, older sites, stranger alignments, and you're going to want to be here when the next set of results comes back.